They beat me with a leather belt. Not strangers, my own son and daughter. I left the ranch with $1 in my pocket and a broken rib. For 35 years, I raised them on that land. Now they call me unfit. I thought I lost everything that night. But what they didn't know was that the land they stole would never be theirs. Not after what they did. The house was quiet that morning. Not peaceful, just quiet. The kind of quiet that settles after a storm, but you know the wind hasn't gone far. I boiled water the way Victor used to do it, heavy kettle on the old stove. He always said coffee should smell like home, not like a machine. I opened the back door just enough to let the cold in. Nevada mornings in March are sharp and dry, the same way grief feels after the casseroles stop coming. It had been 7 months since the funeral. Derek hadn't visited once since. Noelle called twice, both times about the land. But yesterday, I got a text. "We're coming tomorrow. Gonna talk about how to keep the ranch going. Gonna help you out." I read it twice. My fingers stiffened around the phone. That word, help. It sat strange in my mouth. Still, I cleaned the guest rooms, dusted the framed photos on the hallway wall, the one of Derek holding his first calf, Noelle brushing Snowy, her favorite mare, Victor on the porch in his faded straw hat. I didn't cry. I just dusted slower than usual. The floorboards creaked when I walked past the dining room. Same sound they made the night we brought Derek home from the hospital. That woods held every season of my life, every fall, every step, every goodbye. I stood there a long minute, looking out at the fence line. Beyond it, the east pasture. 200 acres. Beyond that, the canyon. Our land stretched far. And yet, I felt cornered in my own kitchen. By noon, I had a roast in the oven. The same meal Victor always made on hard days. The smell carried me through. It kept me from pacing. At 3:27, a black SUV came up the drive. I watched it roll across the gravel like it belonged there. The sound of tires crunching dirt was louder than it should have been. Derek stepped out first, taller than I remembered. Noelle followed, carrying a leather briefcase instead of her old canvas tote. She didn't smile, neither did I. They came in like visitors, not like my children. And the way Derek looked around the room, it wasn't nostalgia in his eyes. It was calculation. He patted the kitchen table once, like testing its sturdiness, then sat. Noelle placed her briefcase down gently, unclicked the latches, and laid out papers like placemats. No hugs, no mention of Victor, just folders, maps, deeds, valuation charts. I stood by the stove, hands gripping the edge of the sink. The roast had gone cold. You ever feel a room shift without anyone saying a word? Like something precious just left through a door that never opened. That was how the visit began. And I knew. Whatever they came for, it wasn't me. Noelle slid the first paper toward me like it was just another grocery list. The heading read, "Preliminary Transfer of Property Rights." I didn't touch it. Derek leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. He spoke first. He said the taxes were climbing and the maintenance costs on the land were unsustainable. He said the fences needed replacing and the barn roof leaked, and I was too old to manage it all. He said selling a portion of the land would solve everything. Just a few hundred acres. The east pasture. Maybe some of the ridge. Just enough to lighten the burden. Noelle nodded like she was agreeing with a lecture she'd already heard a dozen times. Her voice was softer, measured, as if it would make the ask more digestible. She said it wasn't about cutting me out, said I would still live here, just as I always had. Nothing would change, just a signature. I looked down at my hands. The skin had thinned. Veins rose like rivers. The knuckles were swollen more often than not. I remembered every fence post I had hammered, every foal I had fed by hand. I remembered Victor hauling hay in the dead of winter while I poured boiling water over frozen locks. This land never gave anything easy. It taught us how to stay. I asked them who was buying. Derek said a development group from Reno, green energy project, wind farms, maybe solar. They'd keep the landscape intact, he claimed. Said it would bring jobs. Said it would bring in money we could use to fix up the ranch, maybe even hire help. He made it sound generous. Noel slid another document forward. This one was typed in thicker legal language. I could barely keep my eyes on the page before the words blurred. Derek said he already talked to someone at the bank, said the process would be simple if I just cooperated. I told them I needed time. I didn't say no. I didn't say yes either. I just asked for time. Derek's jaw clenched. Just for a second. He masked it quick. Noelle cleared her throat and started gathering the papers slowly. Derek stood, said they would go check on the horses while I thought things over. I nodded and watched them leave the room like nothing had just happened, like that wasn't a demand disguised as a discussion. Once the door shut, I finally exhaled. The roast sat untouched. The house smelled of thyme and rosemary and something else. Something I couldn't name. Not quite smoke. Not quite rot. Just the thick scent of a room that used to mean comfort, but now meant pressure. I walked to the living room and sat in Victor's chair, the one that still held the indent of his frame. I stared at the spot on the mantel where we kept the original deed. We framed it together the day we paid off the last acre. It wasn't fancy, just a yellowing page in a wooden frame, but it meant something. I stayed there for an hour, maybe 2. The sun dipped behind the barn and painted the pasture gold. I knew then they weren't just visiting. They didn't come home to help. They came to take. And somehow, I think they believed I wouldn't notice. They didn't bring up the papers again that night. Instead, Derek went out to check the barn like he said. Noelle stayed inside, scrolling her phone like she wasn't really in the room. I offered her a blanket. She didn't answer. It wasn't until morning that things shifted again. The knock came early, before sunrise. I was in the kitchen feeding the dogs, the coffee barely brewed. Derek stood at the back door, still in jeans and boots, already laced. He asked if I could come help with something in the tack room. Said there was a broken latch on one of the saddle trunks. His voice was even, maybe a little too calm for that hour. I hesitated. My hands were damp from the dog bowls. I dried them on my apron and followed him out without a word. The tack room smelled the same as always. Leather, dust, liniment, a little mold. I flipped the switch. The overhead bulb hummed, slow to warm up. Derek stepped aside, holding the door. I walked in first. That was my mistake. Noelle came in behind me and closed the door. It wasn't loud what happened next. There was no yelling, no slamming, no rage in their faces, just coldness, efficiency, like they'd planned it. The first crack of the belt caught my side. I turned too slow. Derek gripped my arm, forced me down onto the bench where we used to tie saddle straps. Noelle's hands held the other shoulder. I didn't even hear what they were saying. It was muffled by the ringing in my ears and the sound of the leather moving through the air. Not many strikes, maybe 3, maybe 4. Enough to bruise, to frighten, not to break bones. I knew that part was intentional. They stopped when I stopped resisting. I wasn't crying. I wasn't screaming. I just stared at the old cabinet where Victor used to keep the feed ledgers. There was a deep scratch in the wood he'd carved by accident once, shaped like a crooked T. I focused on that. When Derek let go, I stayed sitting. Noelle pulled out a folded paper from her coat. Same documents from yesterday, only this time, no words. She placed the folder on the bench beside me, said I could sign it or think about it, but next time might not be so easy. They left. The door stayed open behind them. I sat there long after the bulb stopped humming. I ran my fingers over the folder but didn't open it. My ribs ached when I moved. I took that as a signal to stay still. Eventually, I stood. I didn't take the papers with me. I left them there, beside the hook where we used to hang the halters. I walked back to the house slow, holding my side. Inside, the clock on the microwave blinked 7:12. I poured cold coffee from the pot, drank it like it was medicine. They had gone silent again, back in the guest room, pretending to sleep. I went to the bathroom, lifted my shirt, purple forming beneath the ribs, angry and dark. No broken skin, just enough damage to carry. That evening, when they left to meet someone in town, I walked to the barn again. I took the belt, rolled it, wrapped it in a plastic feed bag, and stuffed it under the haystack behind the mule pen. Not to hide it, to remember. That night, I slept in Victor's chair. I didn't lock the doors, but I moved the shotgun a little closer. They hadn't just hurt me. They'd marked something in this place. And I knew deep down, whatever came next wouldn't just be about land anymore. The morning after they hit me, Derek acted like nothing had happened. He poured himself coffee and whistled while the toaster popped. Noelle stayed in the guest room longer than usual. When she came out, her hair was still damp and she had her phone pressed to her ear, whispering numbers. They left before noon, said they had to meet someone in town. I didn't ask who. I didn't say anything. I waited until their car disappeared past the tree line. Then I went to the barn. The folder was still where I left it, tucked between the bench and the wall. I picked it up with both hands, more careful than I expected myself to be. My ribs still hurt when I bent, but the ache was duller now, like something settling into place. Back in the house, I laid the folder on the kitchen table and opened it slowly. Inside were printed maps of the property. Our land was highlighted in pink, with numbered sections labeled for sale. 2 full pages of signatures and disclaimers followed. In one margin, Noelle had scribbled a note in blue pen. Phase 1, March. My stomach turned when I read it. They weren't just trying to get a portion of the land. They were preparing to sell it in stages. Phase 2 was marked for July. That would include the south pasture, the barn, the mule pen, everything Victor and I had poured ourselves into. I looked for a signature line. Mine was already printed there, blank, waiting. But above it, the date was filled in. March 15th, my birthday. That detail was like a splinter under my skin. That night, I didn't sleep. I moved from room to room, turning on lamps, sitting in chairs I hadn't used in years. Every space whispered something back. This was Victor's reading corner. That was the chair Derek fell asleep in during storms. The coat rack still held Noelle's old denim jacket. I'd kept it all. I'd held on to every sign they were mine. But they weren't those kids anymore. In the early morning, I went to the filing cabinet in the mudroom, pulled out the folder labeled Deed and Inheritance. Inside was a single-page document Victor and I had drafted 15 years ago. It wasn't official, just notes. But it was enough to remind me what we once agreed on. Victor always said the land should go to someone who would love it, not just use it. That it had to stay whole, or not at all. I folded the notes and put them in my apron pocket. Then I made a phone call. Not to a lawyer. Not yet. I called Edna. Edna had worked at the county recorder's office before she retired. She was the one who'd helped us update our water rights back in 2006. She answered on the second ring, her voice cracked with sleep, but she listened carefully. I told her I just had some questions about private land protections. That was all. She said she'd come by with coffee, said it had been too long anyway. By the time Derek and Noelle returned that evening, I was back at the stove, stirring beans like I always did on Fridays. They walked in quiet. Derek sniffed the air, said something about it smelling like childhood. Noelle didn't speak, just sat down, set her phone face down, and looked straight at me. Her voice was low. She said they'd be moving up the timeline, said they needed me to sign the papers by the end of the week. I wiped my hands on a dish towel, turned off the stove, and said I'd think about it. But I already had. I wasn't going to sign, and they were about to find out what that really meant. They started treating me like I was in the way. Not in words, not directly, but I felt it in the smallest things. Noelle rearranged the pantry without asking, said it was more efficient that way. Derek took the truck into town without a word, left me to use the mule cart with a half-dead battery. They stopped calling me Mum. They barely used my name. By the third day, it was like I was a guest in my own kitchen. I stopped trying to cook. They started ordering food or eating out. Noelle said she didn't trust the old freezer. Derek said he was cutting carbs. I didn't argue. I just stepped aside. But I noticed. Noelle had started spending hours on her laptop. When she left it open, I saw spreadsheets labeled by acreage, dates, projected revenue. One tab had a heading that read, Conversion, April target. Another tab was an email draft to someone named Leo, outlining pending agreement on Southern Tract once matriarch signs. That word, matriarch. It felt strange coming from her, like I was a figurehead, not a person, like they'd already decided I was done. They spent less and less time talking to me and more time talking over me, planning around me. It wasn't even subtle anymore. Every sentence began with, once we finalize the sale, or when we move forward with permits. I was a placeholder, a delay, an inconvenience, and they were waiting me out. That Sunday, Edna came by just after lunch. She brought lemon muffins and wore her gardening gloves like she forgot to take them off. We didn't sit at the kitchen table. I led her out to the hay shed. It was too risky in the house, too many ears. She gave me a name, a woman who used to work for the Bureau of Land Management, now did private consulting, said she could help me review any documents, see what protections still applied from Victor's original contracts. Said she knew about conservation easements and had dealt with bad family transfers before. I thanked her. Then I walked her out like it was just a social visit. Derek was by the truck when we came out. He looked up, squinted at Edna, then nodded. He didn't say anything, but I saw it in his eyes. He knew something was moving. That night, Noelle brought out the folder again, said she was tired of dragging this out, said if I didn't sign by Tuesday, they'd have no choice but to go another route. I asked her what that meant. She said they'd already spoken to a lawyer, said there were ways around things, said they could prove I was no longer capable of managing the land, that I'd refused medical attention, that I'd shown signs of confusion, said it was for my own good. I stood there with the folder in my hands. The kitchen was warm from the oven, but I felt cold in my arms. Her words didn't land all at once. They settled slow, like ash. They were going to try to take it, with or without me. That night, I moved everything important into the root cellar. The deed, Victor's old ledger, the notes I found in the mudroom, even the photo albums. I wrapped them in plastic, placed them in a sealed tub, and tucked them behind the potato crates. Then I went upstairs and sat on the edge of my bed, facing the window. The wind had picked up. The old sycamore by the barn swayed hard against the sky. I watched it move, thinking about roots, about what holds and what breaks. They thought I was the barrier, the last piece in their way. But they hadn't realized something. I wasn't just the final block. I was the foundation, and I was about to shift. Tuesday morning came with a dry wind, the kind that scraped dust across the porch like sandpaper. I stood at the window long before either of them stirred, watching a single tumbleweed roll across the front yard like it was going somewhere I couldn't. The kitchen was cold. I didn't bother lighting the stove. My hands moved on habit, setting a single cup, not three. That was the first time I stopped setting a place for them. Something small. But it felt like pulling a pin from a quiet grenade. They came down late. Derek didn't speak. Noelle had her laptop open before she even sat. They didn't ask for breakfast. They didn't look at me. By noon, she placed the folder back on the table, open to the signature line. A black pen laid next to it, like a knife waiting for a hand. She said this was my last chance. I nodded once, picked up the folder, closed it gently, and walked to the pantry. I slid it onto the top shelf behind the flour tin. I didn't say a word. Derek exhaled hard, pushed back from the table and left. Noelle stared at me for a long moment. I could feel her eyes measuring me, trying to calculate how much of me was left to break. Then she followed him. I waited until they drove off. I didn't know where they were going, but I knew what I had to do. I went to the root cellar, pulled out the sealed tub. Everything was still there. The deed, Victor's notes, the contact Edna gave me. I laid it all out on the dining table, piece by piece, like I was setting the foundation of a house. Then I picked up the phone and dialed the number she had scribbled on the back of the muffin box. Her name was May Campbell. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was steady, low, like someone who knew too many secrets and forgot none. I told her I wasn't ready to file anything yet. I just needed someone who could walk me through what protections I had. May said she could be there the next afternoon. When I hung up, I didn't feel relief. Not yet. Just the sense that something bigger had started to move, slow and deep, like groundwater. That night, I opened the old safe in Victor's office. The combination hadn't changed. Inside were things I hadn't touched in years. Letters, insurance policies, a lock of Noelle's baby hair in a paper envelope, and one more thing, a cassette tape, labeled in Victor's handwriting, for after. I'd never listened to it. He recorded it just after his first stroke, said it was nothing, said he didn't want to talk about it. I brought the old player from the garage and pressed it in. His voice came through soft, worn by time. He talked about the land, about the kind of people he hoped would inherit it, about what made a place sacred wasn't fences or deeds, but memory. He said if anything ever went wrong, and if I couldn't trust our own, I should make it public. He said, sometimes shame is more powerful than any court order. I sat with that tape for a long time. The next morning, I made copies of every document. I printed photos of the bruises, taken 2 days after they hit me. I wrote a statement in my own hand, just a page, detailing everything from the first day they arrived. I packed it all in a manila envelope and labeled it, in case. Then I went back to the kitchen. I made coffee. I opened the window. When they returned later that day, I smiled. Because I wasn't just someone refusing to sign anymore. I was someone prepared, someone they hadn't expected, and they had no idea what I'd just put in motion. The first sign came quietly. Wednesday morning, Derek parked the truck halfway down the drive instead of near the barn. Noelle was already on the phone before she reached the porch. Her voice was too cheerful, too polished, like she was speaking to someone important. I didn't ask. I just kept pruning the tomato beds near the fence. I bent slow, careful with my side, careful not to wince. By noon, a black SUV rolled up. Not a neighbor, not someone from town. The driver wore a grey blazer and carried a leather briefcase. I knew what that meant. What that? He introduced himself to Noelle and Derek, shook their hands with the kind of smile that always comes before bad news. I stepped back from the garden and watched from the kitchen window as they led him inside. 10 minutes passed, then 15. When he came out again, he walked slower, more thoughtful. He looked over his shoulder once before getting in his car. An hour later, Derek called me into the dining room. He said they'd scheduled a wellness review. Said it was standard. Said I needed to be evaluated by a third-party specialist to make sure I was still capable of making financial decisions. Said this was all just to clarify my role moving forward. Noelle folded her hands like a schoolteacher. She said it was nothing personal, just protection. For everyone. I didn't answer. But I went to my room and pulled the copy of the land survey Victor and I had framed back in '98. It still had the handwritten notes in the corner. Just numbers. Acreage. But to me, it was a map of years. Of everything we'd built. They wanted to prove I was unfit. They were setting a stage. That evening, I went to see Reverend Claude. He wasn't just our pastor. He was Victor's friend. He officiated our wedding and buried my parents. I brought him a peach pie and told him I needed a witness. Someone who could vouch that I was still present, still sound. He listened, then nodded without asking questions. Said he'd stop by the next day. The appointment came Friday morning. A woman in a grey coat arrived with a clipboard and polite eyes. She smiled too much. Said her name was Dana. Asked if I knew what day it was. I told her. She asked who the president was. I answered. Then she asked if I knew where I was. That was the only time I hesitated. I looked around my own kitchen, the yellow walls, the cracked clock above the stove, the linoleum worn through at the fridge. Then I looked her straight in the face and said, I was standing in the house I paid for, on the land I had worked for 5 decades, surrounded by people trying to erase me. She didn't write anything down after that. The interview ended quiet. She shook my hand gently, said she appreciated my clarity. Then she stepped outside with Derek and Noelle. I don't know what she told them, but their faces were tighter when they came back in. Noelle wouldn't look at me. Derek rubbed the back of his neck like something had backfired. That night, I didn't sleep in my bed. I stayed in the old rocker on the porch, wrapped in Victor's coat. The stars were sharp and high, the kind of night that made silence feel like a person sitting beside you. I thought about what it meant to be declared gone while you were still breathing, still thinking, still holding on to something that mattered. They weren't finished yet. But neither was I. They tried to paint me as fading. What they didn't see was that I was sharpening, quietly, steadily, and I was getting ready to cut clean. Sunday came with an odd stillness. Derek was unusually polite, setting the table without being asked. Noelle pulled out a roast from the freezer and started cooking around noon, humming a song I didn't recognize. She asked if I wanted carrots or green beans. I answered without looking up. Something in the air felt too measured, like they were building a stage again, this time with napkins and mashed potatoes. By evening, the table was set for 3. Candles, cloth napkins, even the good plates Victor and I only used on Christmas. Derek poured wine. Noelle served carefully. Everything was perfect. Too perfect. And that's when I knew this wasn't a meal. This was an act. I took my seat without a word. My hands stayed folded in my lap. They made small talk. Derek brought up the weather. Noelle mentioned the horses needing their hooves checked. Then the silence came, the kind that hums underneath everything, waiting to snap. Noelle reached into her cardigan and pulled out a second folder, a newer one, slimmer. She placed it gently beside my plate. She said it was an adjusted version, simplified. She smiled like this was mercy. Derek added that the buyer was already lined up. A man from Nevada, ready to make an offer on the southern tract if we moved quickly, said it would take pressure off me, said it was time I rested. I didn't touch the folder. I looked at them and thought about what Victor once told me, that there's a difference between letting go and being taken from. I unfolded my napkin slowly and set it on the table. Then I stood and left the dining room. I went to the office, locked the door behind me, sat at the desk and opened the drawer where I had stashed the envelope marked in case. I added something to it. A printed photo. The one I had taken 2 nights earlier from the hallway, where the folder sat unattended on the kitchen counter with the buyer's contact information visible. Then I took out the old flip phone I kept in the drawer, one I hadn't used in years. It still had battery. It still had Edna's number saved in the contacts. I texted her a single word. Ready. 20 minutes passed. I returned to the dining room. The food was cold now. The candles had burned halfway down. Derek and Noelle were still sitting, still pretending this was normal. I thanked them for dinner, said I wasn't hungry. Then I told them the truth, that I had contacted someone about a conservation easement on the land, that I was reviewing legal channels for protecting the entire property, that any sale without my signature would be challenged, and that I had enough documentation now to open an investigation into coercion and elder intimidation. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten. I just spoke like someone who knew what she was doing. Derek turned red. Noelle went pale. They didn't speak for a long time. When they finally stood, they didn't clear the table. They walked past me, up the stairs, and shut the door. That night, I stayed in the kitchen. I poured myself a glass of wine, sat under the dim light, and listened to the house breathe. I had protected everything I could: the land, the history, the woman I used to be. And for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like prey. I felt like the storm they had called down on themselves, and it was just beginning to rain. The next morning began without a word. Noelle didn't come downstairs. Derek stood by the kitchen window sipping coffee, but didn't make eye contact. The folder from last night had disappeared from the table, and I knew then that the deal wasn't just off, it had turned on them. By mid-morning, I was already dressed and waiting. I wore Victor's old denim jacket, the one with the patch on the shoulder where he'd once torn it fixing the fence. I needed the weight of it on my shoulders. May Campbell arrived in a silver sedan, dust trailing behind her down the driveway. She stepped out, holding a leather satchel, nodded once, and followed me through the front door like she had lived there all her life. Derek stepped forward as if to intercept. May didn't stop walking. She simply said her name, her credentials, and handed him a sealed envelope. Inside were copies of the draft easement paperwork, letters of inquiry sent to 2 state preservation agencies, and a notice of potential review regarding elder intimidation. Noelle came down halfway through. She saw May in the living room, glanced at the documents, and froze. May sat across from me on the couch. We talked plainly. She asked if I had changed my mind about the full conservation filing. I said no. I said the land was never meant to be divided. I said Victor had built it whole, and it would stay whole. Derek tried to argue. He said I was being manipulated, that the land was too valuable to sit untouched, that I had no right to hold up progress. I let him finish. Then I took out the old voice recorder, I pressed play. The clip wasn't long, just under 3 minutes. It was the audio I had captured 3 weeks ago, the morning they hit me in the tack room. I had found the recorder later under a pile of old feed receipts, forgotten until the bruises began to fade. The sound wasn't graphic, but the silence in it was worse than shouting. Their cold voices, the calm instructions, the threat Noelle made at the end. May listened quietly. When it ended, she turned to them and said she was now legally obligated to advise I seek protection through formal legal channels. She asked if I wanted her to initiate the next step. I said yes. Noelle walked out. Derek stood in place, fists clenched, staring at the rug like it had betrayed him. The house was quiet but heavy. Every corner felt full of breath and judgment. By evening they had packed. No words, no apologies, no attempts to explain. Just boxes, clicks of latches, the smell of their perfume and aftershave trailing behind them like ghosts. I stood on the porch as they loaded the last bag. Derek looked back once, eyes narrowed, jaw set. But there was nothing left in him to argue with. I had stripped away the power he thought he held. They drove off just after sunset. The gravel crunched beneath their tires, long and slow. Then it was gone. Silence returned like an old friend who didn't need to ask anything. I walked through the house after, room by room. I opened windows, let the night air move through. I picked up stray napkins, wiped the counters, put the dishes away they never washed. Then I went to the safe and placed the recorder beside the deed, closed it. The land was quiet again, my name still on it, my breath still in it. They had come to take what they thought was theirs, but what they left behind was mine, whole and untouched. Not because I fought loud, but because I never stopped listening. For the first time in months, the house exhaled. There was no noise upstairs, no tense footfalls across the hall, no screen doors slamming, just the hum of the fridge and the creak of the porch swing as the wind passed through. Silence had returned, but not the lonely kind. This silence felt earned. I spent the next few days returning things to their place. The kitchen shelves were rearranged. I moved the flour back to the bottom cabinet and tossed out the protein powders and detox teas Noelle left behind. In the living room, I folded the throw blanket over the arm of the couch where Victor used to sit. Not because I needed to, but because I wanted to feel like someone was still there. The barn took longer. Derek had left tools scattered. There were tire tracks near the old gate, like he'd tried to haul something before they left. I found the south fence loose in 3 places, boards pried away as if someone had tested them for removal. I spent a full afternoon hammering them back in. My hands were sore by sundown, but every nail driven in was another reminder that I still had say here. A letter arrived Thursday. It was from the county office. Inside was a copy of the preliminary review confirming my right to hold the property intact under a private conservation provision. May had worked fast. The letter was dry and bureaucratic, but when I read the phrase primary steward assigned as Marion Rose, I felt something shift in my chest. I was no longer the obstacle they described. I was now recognized as the protector of the land. Still, I didn't feel triumphant. Some evenings, I'd walk past their empty rooms and feel a strange hollowness, not regret, just the quiet ache of loss, even when what was lost had been cruel. The human heart doesn't always make clean lines between grief and relief, but I didn't let that slow me. Instead, I called Mrs. Devlin, the music teacher from town. She ran a small weekend program for kids with no place to go when school let out. I told her the West Barn was open if she ever needed space. She cried over the phone, said she'd been looking for something just like that, something that felt safe. Safe. That word hadn't belonged in this house for a long time. Now it did. By Saturday, she and 2 volunteers came out to sweep, clear cobwebs, and set up folding chairs. I watched from the porch for a while, then brought them iced tea and stayed to help. We didn't talk about what the place had been. We only talked about what it might become. That night, I sat on the back steps and watched the wind bend the wheatgrass at the far edge of the pasture. The sky was streaked with gold. The air smelled clean. And in that moment, I didn't feel like someone who had been abandoned. I felt like someone who had been returned to herself. Not because the house was mine again, not because the papers said so, but because I no longer had to fight for breath inside my own name. I knew Derek and Noelle were out there somewhere, nursing whatever stories they told themselves to sleep at night. But they couldn't touch what I had anymore. Not the land, not the legacy, not the stillness. They thought they could define what I was worth on paper. But what I protected went deeper than lines or deeds. It lived in the soil, in the bones of the barn, in the way the porch light still flickered at dusk. It lived in me, quiet, steady, unmoved. It was a Tuesday morning when the letter came. No name on the envelope, just my address typed neatly in the center. The postmark was from El Paso. I stood by the mailbox for a moment, letting the sun hit my face before slipping it into the pocket of my apron. I didn't open it right away. Instead, I walked the fence line with the old wire spool, tightening the sections Derek had loosened months before. I stopped to refill the chickens' water and tossed some feed to the barn cat that had started following me around since the kids came. I swept the porch. I changed the sheets in the guest room, though no one had asked to visit. Only then, as the light turned soft and long through the kitchen windows, did I sit down at the table and slit the envelope open. It was from Noelle. Not handwritten, typed, crisp margins. A letter that read more like a contract than a confession. She said they were in Arizona now, that Derek had picked up part-time work managing properties, and she was exploring a small consulting business. She said they were stable. She said she hoped I was well. And then she said what I expected her to say, that they regretted how things unfolded, that tensions had been high, that everyone had said things they didn't mean. She used the word miscommunication more than once, but nowhere in that letter did she say sorry, not for the bruises, not for the folder, not for the way they tried to unwrite me out of my own story. She closed by saying they might like to visit at some point, to talk, to reconnect. I folded the letter in half and slid it under the yellow pad on the corner of the table. I didn't tear it up. I didn't frame it. I just let it sit there, like a stone at the bottom of a quiet stream. Later that evening, I lit a fire in the hearth. The air had turned crisp again, the way it does in early spring when the sun lies about warmth. I sat in Victor's chair with the quilt over my knees, letting the crackle fill the silence. I thought about how long it takes for people to understand what they've broken, and how often, by the time they do, the pieces are no longer theirs to touch. The barn kids came by that weekend. Laughter echoed from the field where they chased each other through the hay rows. Their mothers stayed behind on the porch, sipping coffee and talking low, grateful for the stillness. One of them, a woman named Tasha, brought me a jar of lemon preserves. Said she hadn't seen her son smile like that in weeks. I placed it beside the others in the pantry. My shelves were full of thank yous now. Small ones, honest ones, no folded contracts, no expectations, just quiet gratitude. That night, I walked to the edge of the south pasture. The stars were sharp again, scattered across the sky like they'd been tossed there by a careless hand. I stood there for a while, just listening. The crickets, the wind against the fence. my own breath, slow and certain. I didn't write back, not because I held anger, but because peace, once found, is too sacred to reopen old doors. And mine had finally shut, firm, gentle, enough. Spring settled into the fields without asking. The grasses rose taller along the west fence. The sycamore behind the barn put out fresh leaves, and the creek ran louder than it had in years. The air smelled of soil and wild fennel. Life had kept going while I'd been surviving. Now I was finally beginning to live again. Each morning I woke before sunrise, not because I had to, because I wanted to. I fed the hens, checked the rain barrels, and sat on the back porch with coffee as the world turned pink and gold before my eyes. There was no rush, no voices clattering over mine, just breath and sky and quiet. One Sunday I found an envelope slid under the barn door. Inside was a hand-drawn thank you card from one of the kids, little stick figures and lopsided hearts. He'd signed his name in bright orange crayon and wrote 4 words that caught me off guard. I feel safe here. I sat with that for a long time. Safe. A word I hadn't felt in my bones for too many years. Yet somehow, I had given it to someone else, without even trying, just by standing still, just by staying rooted, like the land itself. The paperwork for the easement came through 2 weeks later. Official now, stamped and filed. The ranch would never be sold off in pieces, never be stripped or flipped. Its future was no longer in someone else's hands. I called May to thank her. She didn't say much, just that it had been an honor, that women like me reminded her why she kept doing what she did. That night, I walked the field lines with the last of the sun behind me. My boots sank slightly into the soft earth, the way they had when Victor and I first planted the orchard decades ago. I touched the wooden posts we had nailed in with calloused hands and laughter. I let the wind press against my face and didn't flinch. I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for an apology, not for reconciliation, not even for the past to feel less heavy. I had stepped out from under all of it, and the strangest thing was, the land felt lighter too. I am 72 now. My back aches on cold mornings, and my hands don't move as fast as they once did. But I am here, fully, not as a relic, not as a burden, not as a signature waiting to be stolen. I am a woman who stayed, a woman who was underestimated, overlooked, and nearly erased. But in the end, I wrote the last word. And it was mine. If you've ever been told your worth depended on what you could give, not who you are, I hope this story held your hand a little. Sometimes, walking away isn't losing. Sometimes, staying silent is surviving. And sometimes, standing your ground becomes the most powerful legacy of all. If this story reminded you of your own journey, or someone you know, share it with someone who needs to feel seen. We tell these stories not for revenge, but for remembrance. You are not invisible, not forgotten. You are still here.